That certainly would not be a surprise at all. Our next speaker tonight is Randy Long. Randy is a former federal prosecutor who brought narcotics charges ranging from street-level prosecutions of drug dealing to trials for conspiracy. He still does criminal code prosecutions occasionally on behalf of the Crown Counsel Office for the Ministry of the Attorney General. He's also a lawyer in private practice, a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada, a member of the Law Society of British Columbia, and most importantly for us here, a member of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Randy's background as a community organizer and Crown prosecutor led him to the conclusion that prosecuting narcotics offenses is the wrong approach. Join me in welcoming Randy Long.
Thank you, Dana. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. It's no small thing in a dark and stormy night like it is. I want to particularly thank Sensible BC, and I want to thank my fellow members on the panel, because every time I do something like this, I learn a lot more. And one of the things that I want to do is just to kind of re-echo Mayor Corrigan's sentiment and his attitude and experience. LEAP is L-E-A-P, that's Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. It started in much the same theme as did the Vietnam vets against the war in Vietnam. And what it was and what it is an organization, a voluntary organization made of people in law enforcement, and we are everybody. I can assure you, from the DEA through the FBI, through the RCMP, through OPP, we are law enforcement throughout all of North America. Some of the most dedicated, intelligent, committed people that I have ever met in my life, and it's an absolute pleasure to be part of this organization. Ordinarily, I take much more the, I think it's the Groucho Marx approach when I say that I really wouldn't be a member of an organization that would have me, but I can tell you beyond doubt, I am absolutely thrilled to be a member of this organization. I don't speak for the organization per se. That's Neil Franklin. He's our executive director, and he speaks for the organization. But our members who are law enforcement personnel, and that includes me, are allowed to be speakers, and we're told, just speak about what you know. Talk from the heart. Talk about your experiences. Tell people what it's really like. And what we do know is this. We know that the world's economy has been warped, completely warped, probably ruined by a war on drugs that's gone on for more than 40 years, that's been an absolute and utter abject failure. We know that people are dying every day. We know that some 70,000 people are dead in Mexico, more dying all the time. We know that the DEA is running raids in Honduras. We know that Colombia and Afghanistan either are or have been failed states. And we know that we see no end in sight with the process of the war on drugs and prohibition. Specifically, LEAP says that prohibition is not something that should be subject to the criminal law. These are essentially consensual acts that we're talking about that ought not to be prosecuted in the criminal law. And that's the essence of what I'm talking about when I get the opportunity to come out and speak to you tonight and on behalf of Sensible BC, because these essentially consensual acts between and among people, obviously having to do with drugs, generally are not the kind of things that we want to encourage. We all know that more intuitively. Drugs are bad, so they say. But of course the issue is, what's a drug? I mean, anecdotally, I've had this conversation with my doctor. He was prescribing something for me, and I said, no, Lauren, I don't take any drugs. You don't know my background. He stood up and looked at me and said, are you completely stupid? This isn't a drug, it's a medicine, you idiot. I thought, oh, yeah, okay. Well, sometimes I need to be spoken to that directly, and sometimes from another perspective, because somebody's drug is another person's medicine, and that's very much the situation with marijuana, and of course Joy's going to speak more about that. But what I do want to tell you about is more anecdotally some of my experiences in law enforcement, and I can only underscore what Mayor Corrigan said. People who came into the court system that I dealt with were not the people that we think of as criminal. They were criminalized, and it's more than tragic. It's more than horrible. It's completely unnecessary. And so often when I get a chance to talk to and hear from young people, they say, well, it's a joke, right? This whole marijuana thing's a joke. No, it's no joke. It's a criminal problem, and it's something that can ruin your life for all intents and purposes, and it's something that we don't want to have continue. It's wrong, it's inappropriate, it's unnecessary, and it needs to stop. Sensible BC and the approach that they take is one very good approach. When I first heard about it, frankly, I thought, well, that's kind of nutty. You know, who needs one more plebiscite, and why do we need to restructure the law? And yeah, okay, I don't think so. And, you know, it dawned on me a very short period of time ago, and this is the nature of development and people being open to new ideas. I got an email from Len Freeling, and Len's a Colorado-based attorney that we know of, and also, of course, a member of LEAP. And Len said in his email, who would have thought that my life's accomplishment is in marijuana? And he said so dismissively. And one of the reasons why this struck me as an important point is because it's not. And this is what Len's point was. It's not just about marijuana per se. We make that mistake. It's about your freedom, my freedom. And if Stephen Harper doesn't like it, that's fine. Stephen Harper doesn't have to like it, but Stephen Harper doesn't have the right to tell you or me what we do with our lives when it comes to this. That's the message that we need to get out. But the part of this is not something that's so easily said and not something that's so easily fixed. Judge Jim Gray, who's another member of LEAP, he says, what about this war on drugs? Who does the war on drugs serve? Who really is well done by this whole war on drugs? He said, well, first and foremost, the people who profit are the international drug dealers. There's no doubt about it. Terrorists profit from the war on drugs. And why and how is that? Because the prohibition of drugs makes a separate economy. It takes it away from us in the community, and it gives it over to people that we don't want to have using this. There is so much money involved in the war on drugs, and so much money involved in international narcotics, and so much money involved in marijuana right here in River City, that it becomes attractive. It becomes dangerous as gangs, one of the other organizations that profit from the war on drugs, find that in the contest of territory, and that's what it's about. It's not a contest for drugs. It's a contest for territory. They find that this is something worth fighting about. And like LEAP says, and like the individual members of our organization have found out, if you take and put away a murderer, murders stop. You take away and put a rapist, rapists stop. But you take and put away a so-called drug dealer, somebody else just comes in to replace them. It's a never-ending situation. Prohibition simply doesn't work. But what I do want to talk about is anecdotally some of the things that I've seen. And let me tell you this for an example. I did a case, and I do defense work. I did a case just that finished up recently. It was almost 3 years before the court. And this is one of the things that can happen when I've said and talked about what is the effect of law enforcement when they come into contact with the war on drugs. The effect is corruption. And I am, and I remain, a supporter of law enforcement personnel, and I still say that the effect is corruption. And I want to tell you how that corruption takes place is not what you think of. It's not somebody picking up a bushel of money in the darkened room when nobody else can see. It's not just that. What happens is we start to lose control of the community, and we start to lose respect for one another. And that's what happens when we're dealing with the law enforcement approach using this war on drugs. Now, let me try and make that make sense, because what I said was corruption and money. And what's that all about? Because one of the other groups that Jim Gray says profits from the war on drugs is law enforcement. There's money in law enforcement. There's easy money available from the feds in law enforcement. And what happens with any smart administrator in law enforcement today? He or she says, I've got a budget, I need to put bodies on the street, how am I going to do it? Ottawa's going to give me money. And I can use this money to keep more bodies on the street. And here's the connection. Here's a very simple connection. What happens is it's better for municipal politicians because they have money coming from the feds. They have more personnel on the street. It's better for administrators because they can pay the bills. It's smart money. It's the easy money because it's where the money is. And it's a stat-driven process. The prosecutors use stats. The cops use stats. It's a statistic-driven system. Better stats means better money. And that's what's going on in this community and every community in British Columbia. I want to assure you of that. Did you know that the federal prosecutors, when I was a prosecutor, get paid by the hour? Think of that. You get paid by the hour. That's pretty much an incentive to keep working. Think about it from the cop's point of view. What a career or first-class constable makes in the RCMP? About $75,000 a year. It's not nothing, but when you factor in the overtime and the court time, you crank that up to $125,000 a year. You think that's not a corrupting influence? I'll tell you why, and I'll tell you how with this case that I started to talk about. 3 years ago, a probation officer calls down to the RCMP in Nanaimo, and they say, this guy is apparently coming down into your area. Go have a look because he's on a curfew. He's going to stay at this particular place. Now, I want you to focus. Work with me. That's a phone call coming from somebody up in Campbell River to Nanaimo. They go out to the address that they're given. They're simply given a residential address. It's south side of town, so it's rural. They're going out at 10:20 at night. 5 RCMP officers. The RCMP officers that go out, they're the federal guys. They're the green team. 5 cops go out. Now, again, back to my point, why do these particular guys go out? Because they do general investigation work when they're on shift at night shift. 5 cops go out. They find the place is an ordinary-looking residence. There's nobody there. They go up and they knock on the door. There's nobody there. They go look in the windows of the house, knock on the windows. There's nobody there. Then they go over to the barn, and knock on the barn. And there's nobody there. But at that point in time, somebody says, I think I smell marijuana. So back to the detachment that they go. They then send 2 cops the next day, that is the next morning, 9 o'clock that next morning. The 2 cops go and literally stand on the perimeter of the property and they say, yeah, I smell marijuana. You? Yeah, I smell marijuana. Okay. What have they done? They've run the license plates and the ownership for all of the vehicles that they see. They see those are nothing but resident vehicles. There's absolutely no criminal activity associated with that residence. There's no criminal activity associated with any of the owners of those vehicles. They then take, that is the main investigator takes, writes this up in terms of an affidavit applying for a search warrant. That search warrant goes into the fax machine. 7 minutes later, the fax machine pumps out a search warrant. 7 minutes later. And the way I know that is simple. Everybody now knows fax machines. You look at that timestamp when that thing goes in, you look at that timestamp when that thing came out. I assure you, I read pretty quickly as a professional reader. You couldn't read that material inside 7 minutes. That's a justice of the peace that gave that authorization to the police, and that's the magic paper. That's what they used to go in. They found in the back of this barn, which was for all intents and purposes a shop, a tiny, tiny room. That is something the size of a phone booth, and sure enough, there were some marijuana plants in there. They charged my client, who was minding his own business, walking around, that is, doing some gardening, and that set us off in a 3-year odyssey in the court. Now, what happened there is a number of different things. One, of course, the police shouldn't have been there at 10 o'clock at night. There was no reasonable basis for them to be there. 2, they certainly shouldn't have been there sniffing around for marijuana the next day. 3, there was absolutely no sense whatsoever to write up an application for a search warrant, other than the fact that they'd now sent 7 members to this place inside just over 14 hours. They'd spent taxpayers' money. So they really needed something to see for this because it was simply compounding the problem. This matter then went to Crown Counsel, who had a look at this, somebody who used or was doing the job that I used to do, rather than do what they should have, which is have a look at it and say, this is a legal search everywhere. This is ridiculous. This would never go. Of course, they approved the charges. So the matter goes forward. We wind up going through the process in court. We're at a preliminary hearing. I'm doing the defense work for it at this stage. And I say to the one main investigators, by the time you've knocked on the door and confirmed nobody was home, if that's the legitimate basis for being there, why did you go to the barn? The straight answer that I got under oath was, well, we didn't know. We thought maybe somebody was working. In the barn at 10:20 at night with no lights on, no sound of activity whatsoever. Yeah. Well, why did you look into the windows? Well, we thought maybe when we were knocking on the door, they simply didn't hear us. Have you got my point yet? Straightforward questions and ridiculous answers, absolutely unbelievable answers, because we now have junior officers involved in this matter, and they're either coached to say this or they don't have the common sense or self-respect to say, yeah, I guess I got your point. We probably shouldn't have been. Yeah, because it doesn't work that way. Because by the time it's in court, everybody's getting overtime, everybody's getting court time to be in there, and what happens is they put it onto the shoulders of the judge. Now the judge gets to kick it out if he or she is going to. And the person that's most aggravating in the whole process, the one getting paid the least, is the defense counsel. And he or she is the one that brings this whole circus to an end by doing what I did, which was bring a charter application. So, of course, by the time this is now in Supreme Court, and a Supreme Court judge is looking at a charter application, Crown Counsel at this stage is really looking at this in earnest for about the first time, realizing, oh my goodness, this is a charter application, isn't it? Yes, it is. And it's not just an application to exclude evidence as we ordinarily do. No, it's not. It's an application to have this stayed. And that means we've been bad, doesn't it? Yes, that's exactly what that means. It means that it's a miscarriage of justice. You've been bad. This is a disgrace, and we're going to talk about it publicly. I'm going to have to get instructions from Vancouver before I can move forward on this, don't you know? Fine, carry on and get that, says the judge. Well, I don't really have it at this time, says Crown Counsel, so the judge says, fine, we're going to adjourn this. Fine, says I, adjourn it. No problem, I don't do trial by surprise. Let's adjourn it. So they adjourned it. Do you know how long they adjourned it? Work with me. This is trial and answer, call and response. A year. You know why they adjourned it a year? Because the investigator was going off to Afghanistan to teach policing over there. 3 years this matter was before the courts. 3 weeks before it came to trial, I finally got the news. Stay of proceedings, which in lawyers' language means we quit. We're not going to do this thing anymore. 3 years. And you know why it was kicked? Not because it took 3 years to finally do the right thing, because the profit had pretty much been wrung out of it at that stage, and the downside was self-evident. Carrying it through to trial was going to be embarrassing to the Crown, embarrassing to the prosecutors, and embarrassing to the police. And why? Not because I'm so smart or wonderful, but my client had the guts to continue to push this thing forward, because at the first adjournment, he was offered the deal. $250 fine. He said, no, I'm not going to do it. He said, you've tortured me, you've tortured my family for 2 years. I'm not going to do it. I'm taking this thing to trial. Not least of which was the reason that he was innocent. Without his courage to do this, without his conviction to say, no, this is going to work out, it'll be fine, I still believe in the justice system despite all of this taking place, I never would have had a client who said, do it, go ahead and do it. We would never have had that opportunity. And when I tell you it's not supposed to work like that, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. It's a disgrace. It's more than a shame, it's a disgrace. And until we take the economic incentive away from the prosecution of marijuana, we are not going to have a justice system. That is currently the situation that we face, not in Mexico, not in Honduras, but here in British Columbia, here in Vancouver, here in Nanaimo. We have a problem, and the problem that we have is not with people who are hopelessly corrupt like a stereotype. The problem that we have is the corrupting influence of money in the justice system when dealing with drugs. I think that Sensible BC is a fabulous idea because it takes us into the realm of doing something, putting it back in our hands and not the faith in the politicians to fix things. I want to make you slightly afraid because I want to assure you that that 7 minutes produced a search warrant for my client. If it's 7 minutes of vulnerability, you and me and each and every one of us here has that same vulnerability. There's a myth that's out there that marijuana isn't really against the law. Everybody knows cops don't prosecute. I've got news for you. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. We need to stop it, and we need to act sensibly. And I want to thank Dana and Sensible BC for giving us this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.